Last week we talked about bread making, and this week we're going to continue talking about bread making, but we're going to move into wine production. So the common thread here is fermentation, of course, and I wanted to introduce you to fermentation with a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. So here it is: a process of the nature of that resulting from the operation of leaven on dough or on saccharine liquids. So there's our connection, first of all, between leavened dough and saccharine or sugary liquids. So in the first case, we make bread by adding yeast to flour and watching it rise. When we're making wine and beer, we have some sugary liquid, and then we add our yeast, and we get ethanol production. But I wanted to look in a little bit greater detail here. So let's look deeper. Effervescence or internal commotion. So superficially recognizable in bread making is the formation of these gas bubbles that we learned about last week that help the bread dough to rise. And in beer and wine making, that's the formation of CO2 as well, and that's very important in our beer and in wine products like champagne. Less important in table wine, for example. A resulting alteration of properties, that's important too, and let's restrict it to a definite class of chemical changes peculiar to organic compounds and produced in them by the stimulus of a ferment. So we've talked about lactic fermentation pretty extensively. We are going to talk about alcoholic fermentation today and next week, and we'll also eventually talk about acetous fermentation as well, and that is where we convert our sugars ultimately to acetic acid, and you're familiar with that as vinegar. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is our fermenting agent for the most part, although we will see that there are several other organisms that play an important role in fermentation as well, and we'll be introduced to those as we move along. But first, let's take a look at fermentation, and again, before we panic, let's back up and say there are many levels of understanding of this chemistry, and we don't have to worry if we don't understand all of the details of the organic structures that I'm showing you. Fermentation is part of metabolism. But before we get to fermentation, let's just think about what we have to start with. That is lots of complex carbohydrates, sugars. In this case, I've drawn lactose here on the left. Why lactose? Well, we're familiar with it already. We've seen that it's a disaccharide of glucose and galactose. And in order to make metabolic use of that complex carbohydrate, we've got to break it into monosaccharides. So there's another way of drawing a glucose molecule, right? And then glucose enters glycolysis. That's a complex enzymatic pathway where we break glucose down into pyruvic acid. The point of that is the production of energy, of course. We're not getting into the energy production side of things here. We're just looking at the chemical transformations that are relevant. The endpoint of glycolysis is, yes, pyruvic acid. So for the chemist in the audience, I've drawn this as the acid, right? You see this carboxylic acid group here is protonated. We remember that one definition of acids is they can dissociate to release protons, increasing the hydronium ion concentration. So this is the acid form. Pyruvate is the conjugate base that's already lost its proton. In any case, fermentation is where we go. What we've already seen is that we can take pyruvate and convert it to lactic acid. And the point of the bugs doing this is that they get a little extra energy out of it. Again, without going into the details, they get a little extra energy out of it. The benefits, of course, can be souring of a food product, as we talked about last week and previous weeks. Let's see. So, a little bit deeper, what's the metabolic function of fermentation? Well, fermentation often takes place under anaerobic conditions, that is, conditions where oxygen is not present. Now, under these conditions, one way to think about it is that glycolysis stalls. And we'll see why in the next slide. But in order to keep getting energy out of glycolysis, we've got to perform a little fermentation. We've got to perform that conversion to lactic acid. And then energy production can continue. Now, a little bit closer to home is the idea that in working muscle we convert pyruvate to lactate. Uh, in our own muscle tissue, working muscles become anaerobic very quickly, and glycolysis has to keep going at least for a little while, and so we can get a little extra kick by converting pyruvate to lactic acid. Let's look even more deeply. What do I mean when I say that fermentation takes place acting on pyruvate to keep energy production going? Here we're switching from lactic fermentation to alcoholic fermentation. Again, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that's our relevant anaerobe, yeast. Let's take a closer look. Glucose, converted to pyruvate, pyruvic acid, by glycolysis. Now, glycolysis requires, and for the biochemists in the room, this is simplification. For the rest of us, it's complicated. Uh, this glycolytic pathway requires the conversion of NAD plus to NADH. Do we need to go into depth why? Well, suffice it to say that the reduction of NAD plus to NADH is very important, and in the conversion of glucose to pyruvate, and ultimately the NADH is going to get used in something called the mitochondrial electron transport chain, where we get even more energy out of our metabolic products. Now, the trick is that the mitochondrial electron transport chain requires oxygen, so the NADH ultimately gives up its electrons to oxygen. But under anaerobic conditions, what are we lacking? Oxygen. So the NADH just builds up and builds up. And when it builds up, we've consumed all of our NAD plus and we have no more NADH, so what do? Glycolysis stops. Whatever energy we were getting out of glucose degradation, we no longer get that benefit. And so this is where fermentation comes along. Now we have two enzymes, one that converts pyruvate to acetaldehyde and carbon dioxide. So there's where we get our effervescence when we're converting sugar to alcohol. This is the first step, acetaldehyde. This enzyme, for those of you that care, is called pyruvate decarboxylase. Right? We've decarboxylated pyruvate, kicked off this carboxylic acid group. Well, that doesn't actually get us anywhere in terms of kick-starting glycolysis. Where that happens is with an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. And in this case, we convert acetaldehyde to ethanol with the concomitant oxidation of NADH to NAD+. So you can see that the energy that we really get back out of fermentation then is the ability to continue converting glucose to pyruvate and generating energy in the absence of oxygen, and therefore in the absence of mitochondrial electron transport. Okay, is that complicated enough for you? Just remember that in order for the way we'll think about it today is that in order for glucose degradation to continue, we've got to keep our store of NAD. By the way, that's the vitamin niacin. We got to keep our NAD plus stores high. In order to do that, we have to deplete our NADH stores by converting pyruvate ultimately to ethanol. That's fermentation. Let's think again about bread. And I wanted to go back over this. Some of these we've talked about already. I just want to reiterate these points. The life of bread. So there's a life and an afterlife that we want to talk about. First of all, the life. We mix our ingredients, water, flour, yeast. That's a minimum. The yeast gets activated, starts cooking away, starts converting that glucose ultimately into carbon dioxide and ethanol. We knead. We talked about the value of kneading. We won't go back through gluten formation today, but the kneading is what allows that complicated protein network to form that gives bread its wonderful texture. But then there's leavening. So we've activated our yeast, but then the yeast really becomes active, bubbling away, converting those sugars into CO2. This results in the rising of the dough, and this process can take a long time or a short time depending on your specific goals or your specific techniques that you're making use of. Now, we mentioned the term proofing. That's the final rising time before we pop that bread into the oven, and that determines the shape of that bread to a large extent. Baking. Okay, lots of things happening in baking, and we're going to cover many of those today. Let's jump to oven spring, because that again is a concept that we covered last time. So we have all these gas bubbles at room temperature in our rising dough. When we pop that into an oven, those gas bubbles immediately increase in volume. That results in an increase in volume of the loaf. That's oven spring. So we have to be careful as we develop our dough and bake our dough to get the right balance between leavening, proofing, and oven spring to control the size of the loaf. Biggest isn't always the best, as we discussed last time. Other things that are happening as we bake are browning. And right alongside browning is the development of flavor and aroma molecules. And we'll talk about those today. But as well, there's a formation of something called the crumb. This is a baking term that refers to that texture of the cooked bread. So as we pull our bread out of the oven, we let it sit. I strongly advise you to let your bread sit for a little while. What happens as the crumb is firming is that the amylose, remember that's the straight chain carbohydrate polymer of glucose, begins to gel and solidify and form long-scale networks, just like we've talked about the gluten formation as well. What this results in is a sliceable bread. I have a little story to tell you, and part of what I hope we get out of this class is how wonderful the food and dining experience is, and part of that can be the community or camaraderie that you feel with the people that you're eating with and enjoying with. Well, my wife is a baker, and one of the first times she baked bread, this is before we got married, uh, with me, she took that bread out of the oven and immediately, she couldn't wait. She immediately sliced it open because she wanted the slice of warm bread straight out of the oven. Well, what happened? The bread basically shredded, and I said to her, "Oh, Joy, you ruined it. You didn't wait for it to firm up. You ruined the bread." Or I think I said something like, "You destroyed the bread." Oh, and she was. I mean, I'm surprised that we actually got married after that. She was so upset with me. Didn't speak to me for the rest of the day. But it illustrated something that's really important. You have to wait for that amylose to gel, the crumb to form, before the bread can become sliceable. So sometimes it's important not to share all of your vast knowledge of the chemistry of the kitchen with the people that you're sharing your meal with in order to maintain the wonderful interaction. Okay, well, what else happens? So, staling. So we talked about the retrogradation of amylopectin. Amylopectin is that branched polymer and of carbohydrate, of sugar, of glucose. Amylopectin tends to crystallize and squeeze water out of the crystals that form. Remember, I'll refer you back to the picture of the starch granule that I showed you in that lamellar or layered structure of amylose versus amylopectin. Now, so retrogradation is when the water leaves the amylopectin gel and you get this crystal, and that results in a very hard, tough bread. Well, that leads us straight into the afterlife of the bread. Just with a little reheating, as long as the bread isn't too dried out or too stale, a little heat drives that water back into the amylopectin crystal. We reabsorb the water, we rehydrate, and we get back our wonderful texture once again. But sometimes we go too far and we're completely dried out. Then your bread is still valuable and can form croutons, and croutons can be useful as a crunchy addition to and texture alterer to things like salads. Also, we use croutons in other ways. Here I'm mentioning sauce thickener. We'll talk about using breads as sauce thickeners and as well as straight up starch. This can improve the viscosity of your sauce. You can also use bread as a thickener or body agent, and most of us are probably familiar with bread-based stuffings, dried bread, rehydrated in our stuffings that we eat at holidays. So there's life and there's afterlife of bread.